May 16th, 1943, 9:28 p.m, over the Möhne Reservoir, Germany. Wing Commander Guy Gibson throttled back the 4 Merlin engines of his Avro Lancaster bomber and began his descent toward the massive dam wall barely visible in the darkness below. Behind him, 18 more Lancasters circled at altitude, each carrying a weapon so revolutionary that most of the scientific establishment had declared it impossible. A cylindrical bomb weighing 9,250 pounds, designed to skip across water like a stone thrown by a child. The Air Ministry had called it a fantasy. The Admiralty had dismissed it as a waste of resources. Even Barnes Wallis, the brilliant engineer who invented it, had moments where he doubted his own calculations. But on this night, over the industrial heartland of Nazi Germany, 19 crews of the Royal Air Force were about to prove that sometimes the impossible just needs the right combination of physics, courage, and desperation. The story of Operation Chastise, the raid that would become legend as the Dambusters, began not with military planning but with one man's obsession. Barnes Wallis was 55 years old in 1942, chief designer at Vickers Aviation, and already famous for designing the geodetic airframe that made the Wellington bomber one of Britain's most successful aircraft. But Wallis was haunted by a problem that kept him awake at night. How do you cripple Germany's war machine when conventional bombing had proven largely ineffective? The answer, he believed, lay not in destroying factories, but in destroying the infrastructure that made those factories possible: water. Specifically, the massive reservoir dams in the Ruhr Valley that provided hydroelectric power and water supply to Germany's industrial core. The Möhne Dam alone held back 140 million cubic meters of water. The Eder Dam, 200 million cubic meters. If these dams could be breached, the resulting floods would devastate the Ruhr industrial region, knock out power generation, disrupt water supplies, and deal a psychological blow to German morale. But there was a problem. Actually, several problems. The dams were massive concrete structures, some over 130 feet thick at the base. They were protected by anti-torpedo nets, extending deep into the water. They were defended by anti-aircraft guns, and they were located in valleys where conventional level bombing was nearly impossible. Any attack would need to deliver explosive force directly against the dam wall, below the waterline, where the hydrostatic pressure could multiply the blast effect. Wallis began his calculations in early 1942, working nights and weekends in his home study, covering pages with equations and sketches. His wife would find him at dawn, still hunched over his desk, surrounded by crumpled paper and cold tea. The concept was deceptively simple. If you could make a bomb skip across the water surface like a flat stone, it would strike the dam wall and sink alongside it. A hydrostatic pistol would detonate the weapon at a precise depth, creating an explosion enhanced by the incompressibility of water. The blast wave would crack the dam, the water pressure would do the rest. Simple in concept, nightmarishly complex in execution. The first challenge was basic physics. Getting a 9,000-pound cylinder to skip across water required understanding hydrodynamics that even Wallis, with his formidable mathematical background, found daunting. The bomb would need to be spinning backwards at release, creating enough lift to bounce rather than simply crash into the water and sink. The speed of the aircraft, the altitude of release, the rate of backspin, all had to be calculated to within impossibly tight tolerances. Wallis built models and tested them in his garden pond, to the amusement of his neighbours who watched this distinguished engineer throwing barrel-shaped objects into water at odd hours. The models worked. Sometimes. Other times they simply splashed and sank or bounced erratically. The neighbours stopped finding it amusing when one test sent a model careening through a garden fence. Wallis took his concept to the Air Ministry in April 1942. The reception was glacial. Air Marshal Arthur Harris, head of Bomber Command, was focused on the strategic bombing campaign against German cities. He had no interest in what he called panacea targets or gimmick weapons. Harris believed in mass, in overwhelming Germany with thousands of bombers dropping thousands of tons of explosives. One experimental weapon against a handful of dams struck him as a distraction. The Admiralty was equally dismissive. Naval architects examined Wallis's calculations and declared them theoretically sound but practically impossible. The engineering tolerances required were too tight, the weapon too specialized, the attack profile too dangerous. Resources were scarce. Every factory, every machine shop, every worker was already committed to building conventional weapons. Why waste effort on something that probably wouldn't work? But Wallis had one crucial ally. Group Captain Sidney Bufton, Director of Bomber Operations, saw the strategic potential. If the dams could be breached, the impact on German war production would be enormous. More importantly, it would be visible, dramatic, undeniable. Good for morale at a time when Britain desperately needed victories. Bufton arranged for Wallis to present his concept to a wider audience at the Ministry. The demonstration in June 1942 was a disaster. Wallis's prototype bomb, dropped from a Wellington bomber over a test range, broke apart on impact with the water. The observers were not impressed. One admiral was heard muttering that they'd just wasted a perfectly good Wellington. Wallis went back to his calculations. The problem was the casing. It needed to be strong enough to survive the impact with water at over 200 miles per hour, but light enough to skip rather than simply crash through the surface. He experimented with different materials, different shapes, different construction methods. His team at Vickers worked through the summer of 1942, building prototypes, testing them in water tanks, analysing high-speed photography of impacts. Slowly, painfully, they refined the design. By December 1942, Wallis had a weapon that worked in testing. A cylindrical bomb, 60 inches long, 50 inches in diameter, with a wooden outer casing surrounding a steel core containing 6,600 pounds of Torpex explosive, more powerful than TNT. The entire assembly weighed 9,250 pounds. It would be spun backwards using a belt drive connected to the Lancasters hydraulic system, reaching 500 revolutions per minute before release. Dropped from exactly 60 feet at exactly 220 miles per hour, it would skip across the water, strike the dam, roll down the face, and detonate at 30 feet depth, in theory. Wallis arranged another demonstration, this time at the Road Research Laboratory's testing tank at Harmondsworth. On December 4th, 1942, a scaled model successfully skipped across the tank, struck a model dam wall, and behaved exactly as predicted. The observers, including representatives from the Air Ministry, were impressed but cautious. Models were one thing, full-scale weapons were another. The breakthrough came in February 1943 when Wallis finally convinced the Ministry to authorise a full-scale test. On February 26th, over Reculver Bay off the Kent coast, a modified Wellington bomber dropped a full-size Upkeep weapon, the code name for the bouncing bomb. The weapon skipped 3 times across the water, travelled over 800 yards, and struck a target vessel exactly as planned. Wallis, watching from an observation boat, reportedly wept with relief. He had just turned fantasy into reality. But now came an even bigger challenge. Building an operational weapon and training crews to use it, all within 3 months. The dams could only be attacked in May or early June when the reservoirs were full. Any later, and the water levels would drop too low for maximum effect. Any earlier, and the weapon wouldn't be ready. Harris, still sceptical but overruled by higher authority, assigned the task to No. 5 Group. A new squadron would be formed specifically for the mission, designated 617 Squadron. It would be composed of experienced crews, all volunteers, led by someone Harris trusted to pull off what he still considered a near-suicidal operation. He chose Wing Commander Guy Gibson. Gibson was 24 years old and already a legend in Bomber Command. He had completed 2 full tours of operations, first on bombers, then on night fighters, then back to bombers. He had flown over 170 missions, won the Distinguished Service Order twice, and the Distinguished Flying Cross. He was aggressive, skilled, and had a reputation for bringing his crews home. He was also, by his own admission, exhausted and scheduled to be rotated to a desk job. When Harris called him in and offered him one more mission, Gibson accepted immediately. He didn't know the target, didn't know the weapon, just knew it was important enough that Harris was personally asking. That was enough. Gibson began recruiting crews in March 1943. He didn't tell them what the mission was, only that it would be dangerous, probably a one-way trip for some of them, and that volunteers only need apply. Every pilot, navigator, bomb aimer, flight engineer, wireless operator and gunner he approached said yes. Many were on their 2nd or 3rd tours, far beyond the normal operational rotation. They could have said no, they didn't. The squadron assembled at RAF Scampton in Lincolnshire. 19 Lancaster crews, 133 men total, drawn from Britain, Canada, Australia and New Zealand. The average age was 22, the youngest crew member was 18, the oldest was Gibson at 24. They began training immediately with no idea what they were training for. The requirements were bizarre. Low-level flying, extremely low-level, down to 60 feet above water. Precision navigation to hit specific waypoints at night. Formation flying at heights where one mistake meant instant death. And strangest of all, dropping practice bombs at exactly 60 feet altitude while travelling at exactly 220 miles per hour. The altimeters in the Lancasters were useless at such low heights. The instruments couldn't provide the precision needed. So a young bomb aimer named Flight Lieutenant Bob Hay devised an ingenious solution using 2 spotlights mounted at specific angles under the nose and tail of each Lancaster. When the 2 light beams converged on the water surface, the aircraft was at exactly 60 feet. Simple, brilliant, and it worked. Speed measurement was solved by practice and stopwatches. Navigators timed runs over known distances. Bomb aimers practiced judging the exact moment of release. Hour after hour, night after night, the crews flew low-level runs over English reservoirs, dodging power lines and church steeples, perfecting the impossible. They still didn't know why. The weapons were being manufactured simultaneously at Vickers and other contractors under conditions of extreme secrecy. Each Upkeep bomb required precision machining of steel components, careful packing of Torpex explosive, assembly of the complex hydrostatic fusing system, and construction of the wooden outer casing. The belt drive mechanism that would spin the bomb had to be installed in each Lancaster, along with the hydraulic system to power it, and the release mechanism that would drop the weapon at precisely the right moment. By early May, only 23 Upkeep bombs existed. There were no spares. If more than 23 were needed, the mission would fail because there was no time to build more. On May 15, 1943, Gibson finally briefed his crews on the target. The room fell silent as he pointed to reconnaissance photographs of the Muna and Ida dams. Some of the men had been speculating for weeks, wild theories about secret rockets or impossible targets. The truth was somehow both more believable and more terrifying than any rumour. The plan was straightforward in concept, nightmarish in execution. 3 waves of aircraft. The first wave, 9 Lancasters led by Gibson, would attack the Muna Dam. If they breached it with bombs to spare, they would continue to the Ida. The second wave, 5 aircraft, would attack secondary targets. The third wave, 5 aircraft, would act as a mobile reserve, attacking wherever they were needed most. The route would take them across the North Sea at wave-top height to avoid German radar, across occupied Holland, threading between known flak concentrations, following rivers and valleys to the targets. They would arrive at the dams around midnight. Each aircraft would attack individually, running along the length of the reservoir, dropping to exactly 60 feet, accelerating to exactly 220 miles per hour, releasing the bomb at exactly 400 yards from the dam wall. 2 wooden towers on the dam, 600 feet apart, would serve as visual references for the bomb aimer. When the towers lined up in a simple bomb sight, essentially 2 nails stuck in a triangle of wood, the aircraft was at the correct release point. Get any parameter wrong, altitude, speed, distance, and the bomb would miss. Too high, and it would break apart. Too low, and it would sink. Too fast, and it would skip over the dam. Too slow, and it would sink before reaching the wall. Release too early, and it would explode harmlessly in the reservoir. Release too late, and it would strike the dam but not roll down to the correct depth. The margin for error was essentially 0. Oh, and they'd be doing all this while German anti-aircraft guns fired at them. The Muna Dam had at least 6 20mm flak guns positioned on the towers and dam wall. The Eder had fewer guns but was located in a narrow valley, requiring a diving approach that would leave attacking aircraft completely vulnerable. Each crew had 1 bomb, 1 chance. Gibson didn't sugarcoat it. Some of you won't come back, he told them. We all know that. But if we pull this off, we'll have done something no one else in this war has done. We'll have hit them where it really hurts, and when your grandchildren ask what you did in the war, you'll have one hell of a story to tell. They took off at 9:39 p.m. on May 16th. 9 Lancasters of the first wave staggered at intervals. Gibson led in AJG for George. Each aircraft carried its spinning, deadly cargo slung beneath the bomb bay, already being spun up to operational speed by the belt drive. The 90,000 250-pound weapon was rotating backwards at 500 RPM, the entire Lancaster vibrating from the gyroscopic force. The flight across the North Sea was uneventful, 19 Lancasters skimming the wave tops at 100 feet, low enough that spray occasionally hit the cockpits. They climbed to 500 feet over the Dutch coast, then dropped back down to treetop height, racing across the dark countryside at over 200 miles per hour. Navigation was by moonlight and memory. The navigators had studied reconnaissance photos and maps until they could draw the route from memory. Every river, every village, every distinctive landmark was burned into their minds. They flew by visual reference, no radio, no navigation beacons, nothing that could give away their position. The first casualties came before they reached the target. Flight Lieutenant Bill Estelle in AJB flew too low over power lines near Dulman. His Lancaster struck the lines, cartwheeled, and exploded in a massive fireball visible for miles. All 7 crew members died instantly. Squadron leader Henry Maudsley in AJH reported flak damage, but continued toward the target. Pilot officer Lewis Burpee in AJS was hit by flak near Ham and went down, another massive explosion marking 7 more lives lost. The remaining aircraft of the first wave pressed on. Gibson reached the Moona Dam at 12:10 a.m. on May 17th. The reservoir stretched before him, a vast expanse of dark water reflecting moonlight. At the far end, the massive dam wall rose like a cliff, the 2 targeting towers clearly visible. He could see the flak guns on the towers already traversing, the gunners alerted by the sound of Merlin engines echoing through the valley. Gibson began his run. Behind him, his crew prepared for combat. Flight Lieutenant Bob Hutchison in the front turret, Flight Sergeant George Deering in the rear turret, ready to suppress the flak guns. Flight Lieutenant Torga Tarum navigating, Pilot Officer Frederick Spafford as bomb aimer, watching through the clear nose panel as the water rushed by 60 feet below. The spotlights were on, 2 beams of light racing across the water. Spafford called corrections, left a bit. Steady, steady. The 2 beams converged. They were at exactly 60 feet. Throttles forward. The Lancaster accelerated to 220 miles per hour. The flak guns opened fire. Tracers arced across the reservoir, bright lines of death searching for the bomber. Gibson held steady. He had to. Any evasion, and they'd miss the release point. Spafford was looking through his bomb sight, watching the towers. They were too far apart, closer. The towers moved in his field of view. Closer. They lined up. Now. The Upkeep weapon dropped away, still spinning at 500 RPM. It hit the water with a tremendous splash, skipped once, twice, 3 times, each skip covering over 100 yards. It struck the dam wall travelling at over 60 miles per hour, bounced up slightly, then rolled down the face exactly as designed. Gibson was already climbing away, banking hard to avoid the hills on either side of the valley when the weapon detonated. 6,600 pounds of Torpex explosive detonated 30 feet below the water surface, 30 feet from the dam wall. The explosion sent a waterspout over 1,000 feet into the air. The pressure wave, contained and amplified by the water, hammered against the massive concrete structure with force equivalent to an earthquake. Gibson circled back looking for damage. The dam was intact. 1 bomb wasn't enough. Flight Lieutenant John Hopgood began his run in AJM. The flak gunners were ready now, fully alert and tracking. Hopgood's Lancaster was hit repeatedly as it raced across the reservoir. Shells tore through the fuselage. 1 engine caught fire. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the cockpit. But Hopgood held his course, steady at 60 feet, steady at 220 miles per hour. His bomb aimer released the Upkeep weapon. It dropped, skipped, struck the dam. But the Lancaster was mortally wounded. As Hopgood tried to climb away, the port wing failed. AJM rolled inverted and crashed into the hillside beyond the dam, exploding on impact. 5 of the 7 crew members died in the crash. 2 escaped, only to be captured. The bomb detonated against the dam. Another massive explosion, another waterspout. Gibson circled again. Still no breach. Flight Lieutenant Mick Martin began his run in AJP. Gibson deliberately flew parallel to Martin, drawing fire from the flak guns, his rear gunner, George Deering, firing back at the towers. The tracers crisscrossing the darkness created a surreal light show, death manifested as glowing lines. Martin's bomb skipped perfectly, struck the dam, detonated. The 3rd explosion sent crack spider-webbing through the concrete, invisible in the darkness but spreading nonetheless. Pilot Officer Melvin Young in AJA made his run. Gibson and Martin now both flying alongside drawing fire. The fourth explosion widened the cracks. The dam was weakening but still held. Squadron leader David Maltby and AJJJ began his approach for the fifth attack. By now the flak gunners were exhausted, their ammunition running low, their nerves shattered by the repeated attacks. Maltby's run was textbook perfect. His Upkeep weapon skipped across the reservoir, struck dead centre on the dam wall, rolled down, and detonated at precisely 30 feet depth. For several seconds nothing happened. Then a section of the dam face, a chunk of concrete over 100 feet wide, simply collapsed. Water began pouring through the gap. Not a trickle, not a stream, a biblical deluge. 140 million cubic meters of water under enormous pressure, finding an opening, forcing it wider, tearing through with unstoppable force. Within minutes the breach widened to over 250 feet. A wall of water 30 feet high began roaring down the Ruhr Valley at over 15 miles per hour. Gibson circled the dam, watching the destruction begin. Below, in the valley, air raid sirens were wailing. German soldiers were running for high ground. Civilians were being routed from their beds, fleeing the approaching tsunami. Power stations went dark as the wave hit. Factories flooded, bridges collapsed, roads disappeared under the torrent. The Muna Dam was breached, but the mission wasn't over. Gibson led the remaining aircraft with bombs to the Edda Dam, 40 miles away. They arrived at 1:15 a.m. to find the Edda Valley shrouded in mist. Worse, the approach required diving from 1,000 feet down to 60 feet while threading between hills on either side. One mistake and you'd fly into a hillside. There were no flak guns at the Ida. There didn't need to be. The geography itself was defence enough. Squadron leader Henry Maudslay made the first approach in AJZ. He aborted, unable to line up properly on the narrow reservoir. He came around again. This time he held his dive, dropped to 60 feet, released his weapon. But something went wrong. The bomb hit the water late, skipped, struck the top of the dam wall rather than rolling down it, and detonated. The explosion caught Maudslay's Lancaster still overhead. The blast damaged the aircraft severely. Maudslay radioed that he was heading home but never made it. His Lancaster crashed near Emmerich, all 7 crew members killed. Flight Lieutenant Dave Shannon in AJL made 5 attempts to line up on the Ida, aborting each time as the approach angles weren't right. The narrow valley, the mist, the darkness, all conspired against him. He finally made his drop on the 6th run. The bomb skipped across the reservoir, struck the dam and detonated. No visible damage. Pilot Officer Les Knight in AJN began his approach. Australian, 22 years old, on his second tour of operations. He flew the narrow valley approach perfectly, dropped to 60 feet over the dark water, and released at the precise moment. His Upkeep weapon performed flawlessly. It skipped 3 times, struck the dam wall dead centre, rolled down to 30 feet depth and detonated. The Edda Dam, like the Muna, was over 130 feet thick at the base, engineered to withstand any natural force. But it wasn't engineered to withstand 6,600 pounds of Torpex detonating directly against its face, underwater, where the explosive force was contained and multiplied by hydrostatic pressure. The dam wall cracked. Water began forcing through. The cracks widened, and then, like the Muna, a section of the wall collapsed. 200 million cubic meters of water began pouring through a breach that rapidly widened to over 200 feet. Another unstoppable deluge began racing down another valley, this one even more destructive because the Edda Valley was more populated. The third wave of Lancasters, the mobile reserve, attacked the Sorp Dam. This was a different type of structure, an earth dam rather than concrete gravity dam, requiring a different attack profile. The Upkeep weapons were ineffective against earth dams, so these aircraft carried different bombs. Only one aircraft, piloted by Flight Officer Ken Brown, successfully attacked the Sorp. His bomb damaged the dam but didn't breach it. By 3 a.m, the surviving aircraft were heading home. Of the 19 Lancasters that took off, 11 returned. 8 aircraft were lost, 53 men killed, 3 captured. It was the highest casualty rate of any bomber command operation to that date. But the dams were breached. The reconnaissance Spitfires that flew over the targets at dawn took photographs that shocked both sides. The Myrna and Ida reservoir were emptying, vast expanses of mud where water had been. The Ruhr Valley downstream was devastated. The town of Neheim was obliterated. Kassel was flooded. Over 1,600 people were dead, many of them not Germans but forced labourers and prisoners of war housed in camps in the valley. 11 factories were destroyed, 25 bridges were gone, 3,000 hectares of farmland were ruined. But the most significant damage was to German morale and Allied morale. The Germans had considered the dams impregnable. The breach demonstrated that nowhere was safe from British ingenuity. If the RAF could destroy dams deep in Germany using experimental weapons, what else were they capable of? For Britain, coming after years of setbacks and grinding attrition, the dam raids were a spectacular, visible victory. The photographs of the breached dams appeared in newspapers worldwide. Churchill called it a triumph of British science and courage. Roosevelt sent congratulations. Stalin, rarely impressed by Western military achievements, admitted it was remarkable. Barnes Wallis, who had watched the mission unfold from Scampton, monitoring radio reports, collapsed in relief when he learned the dams were breached. His wife found him in his study crying. The impossible weapon had worked. 617 Squadron was awarded 33 decorations, including the Victoria Cross for Guy Gibson. But Gibson didn't feel like celebrating. He had lost 53 men, 8 crews gone, men he had recruited, trained with, led into battle. The victory came at a price that haunted him for the rest of his short life. He would be killed in action just over a year later, his Mosquito crashing in Holland during a marking operation. The immediate military impact of the dam raids was less than hoped. German repair crews worked with frantic energy to restore the dams. The Muna was repaired by September 1943 using forced labour. Power generation was restored relatively quickly. Water supplies were disrupted but not eliminated. But the long-term impacts were significant. Germany diverted substantial resources to dam defence, installing additional anti-aircraft guns, barrage balloons, and nets at every vulnerable dam in the Reich. Thousands of troops were assigned to dam protection who could have been used elsewhere. The psychological impact on German leadership was profound. If the British could destroy dams, they might destroy anything. More subtly, the raids demonstrated that British science and engineering were matching or exceeding German capabilities. The Third Reich had built its military doctrine around technological superiority. The bouncing bomb suggested that superiority was eroding. The weapon itself, the Upkeep bomb, was never used again. The dams were too heavily defended after May 1943 for a repeat attack to succeed, but Wallis's principles led to other weapons, the Tallboy and Grand Slam earthquake bombs, conventional weapons that used similar physics to penetrate deep underground before, exploding, destroying U-boat pens, V-weapon sites, and reinforced bunkers. 617 Squadron, the unit created for one mission, became the RAF's elite precision attack squadron, flying for the rest of the war against the most difficult targets. They sank the German battleship Tirpitz using Tallboy bombs. They destroyed V-3 supergun sites. They hit targets other squadrons couldn't reach. The legend of the Dambusters grew over the years, helped by the 1955 film that dramatised the raid, but the reality was more complex and more impressive than any film could capture. The raid succeeded because of a unique convergence of factors: a brilliant engineer who refused to accept that his idea was impossible, a military leadership desperate enough to authorise an experimental weapon, a squadron of volunteers willing to fly a suicidal mission, and physics, immutable, dependable physics that said a spinning cylinder dropped at the right height, at the right speed, from the right distance, would skip across water and destroy a dam. When people said it would never work, they weren't wrong to be sceptical. The margins were impossibly tight. The engineering was at the limits of 1940s technology. The tactical execution required precision that no one had demonstrated before. But sometimes, the difference between impossible and inevitable is just someone willing to prove the skeptics wrong. On the morning of May 17, 1943, as water was still pouring through the breached Murner Dam, a German engineer surveyed the damage. His report, captured after the war, included one remarkable sentence: "We built this dam to withstand any force nature could deliver. We never imagined someone would invent a new force. That was the genius of Barnes Wallis and the courage of 617 Squadron. They didn't defeat the dams through superior force. They invented a new physics, a new weapon, a new tactic, and executed it perfectly under impossible conditions. The bouncing bomb worked because it had to. Because 133 men were willing to bet their lives that physics, engineering, and courage could overcome concrete, steel, and skepticism. 53 of them lost that bet, but the dams fell anyway, and the impossible became history. The immediate aftermath of the raid revealed details that even Wallis hadn't fully anticipated. When German engineers examined the breached Möhne Dam, they found that the explosion had created a phenomenon they called a camouflet, a cavity in the dam wall that propagated cracks through the entire structure. The weapon hadn't simply blown a hole in the dam, it had undermined the structural integrity of hundreds of cubic meters of concrete, causing a cascading failure that no amount of reinforcement could have prevented once it began. The physics were elegant in their brutality. Water is incompressible. When the Torpex explosive detonated 30 feet below the surface and 30 feet from the dam wall, the shockwave had nowhere to go but outward. In air, explosions dissipate, rapidly, their force spreading spherically and losing power with distance. But underwater, confined between the reservoir bottom and surface, with the dam wall acting as a reflector, the blast wave concentrated its entire force against the concrete. The pressure spike at the point of detonation exceeded 30,000 pounds per square inch, far beyond what the dam's designers had considered possible. Engineers who studied the wreckage calculated that a conventional bomb of equivalent size detonated against the dam wall above water would have caused minor superficial damage at best. The same explosive force, delivered underwater at the optimum depth, multiplied its effectiveness by a factor of 3 or more. Wallis had essentially weaponized hydrodynamics, but the success of the weapon obscured how close the raid came to complete failure. Of the 19 Lancasters that took off, 8 were lost before reaching home. That's a 42% casualty rate, unsustainable for any sustained operation. If the mission had failed, if the dams had held, 617 Squadron would have been effectively destroyed for nothing. Harris's skepticism would have been vindicated. The entire concept of precision special weapons would have been discredited. The raid succeeded by the narrowest of margins. At the Möhne, 5 aircraft attacked before the dam breached. If Maltby's bomb had been the 4th instead of the 5th, if that final explosion hadn't been perfectly placed, the dam might have held. The cumulative damage from the previous 4 attacks had weakened the structure just enough that the 5th bomb finished the job. 1 bomb fewer, and the mission might have failed. 1 more aircraft lost on the approach, and there might not have been enough weapons to breach both dams. The crew losses haunted everyone involved. 53 men killed, their average age barely 22. Flight Lieutenant Bill Estelle, who hit the power lines, was 23 and had a wife and infant son. Pilot Officer Lewis Burpee was 24, married just 6 months before the raid. Squadron Leader Henry Maudsley was 21, had survived 2 full tours and died on what was supposed to be his last mission before returning to a training role. Every lost crew represented not just 7 deaths, but 7 families destroyed, 7 sets of parents receiving telegrams, 7 futures erased. Gibson wrote personal letters to every family. The task nearly broke him. What do you tell a mother that her son died because you ordered him to fly at 60 feet over a reservoir while German guns fired at him? That it was necessary, that it mattered, that freedom requires sacrifice. The words felt hollow even as he wrote them. The 3 captured crew members, survivors from Burpee's and Hopgood's aircraft, spent the rest of the war in Stalag Luft III. They were interrogated extensively by German intelligence, who were desperate to understand how the raid had been executed. The prisoners revealed nothing significant. The Germans knew about the bouncing bomb by examining wreckage, but the details of the delivery system, the spotlights, the precise calculations, the training methods, all of that remained secret. German engineers attempted to recreate the weapon but failed. They understood the principle but couldn't replicate the precision engineering that made it work. The Upkeep bomb required manufacturing tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The wooden casing had to be shaped exactly right. The explosive had to be packed uniformly. The hydrostatic fuse had to be calibrated precisely. German industry in 1943, already strained by Allied bombing and resource shortages, couldn't match that precision. There's a persistent myth that the Germans could have prevented the raid entirely if their radar operators had been more alert. The truth is more complex. German radar did detect the approaching Lancasters multiple times. Reports were filed of low-flying aircraft crossing the Dutch coast and heading inland. But the German air defence system in May 1943 was optimised to defend against high-altitude bomber streams, not low-level penetrations by small formations. The radar operators saw the returns, reported them, and were largely ignored because 19 aircraft at low level didn't fit the expected threat profile of a major raid. By the time German fighters were scrambled, the Lancasters were already attacking the dams. Even if fighters had intercepted the bombers, engaging Lancasters at low level in darkness was extraordinarily difficult. The German night fighter force was equipped and trained for bomber stream attacks at altitude where Liechtenstein radar could vector them into firing position. At 100 feet, in darkness, with terrain masking radar returns, interception would have been nearly impossible. The flak defences at the dams themselves were inadequate because no one imagined the dams could be attacked effectively. The Mörner had 6 20mm guns, enough to deter casual attacks, but insufficient against a determined assault. The guns couldn't depress low enough to track aircraft at 60 feet over the reservoir. The gunners found themselves firing at aircraft below their minimum engagement angle, trying to lead targets moving at over 200 miles per hour, while their own positions were being strafed by the Lancasters' gunners. After the first 2 or 3 attacks, several gun positions had been suppressed or abandoned. The German gunners showed considerable courage, continuing to fire at aircraft that were literally shooting back at them, but they were overwhelmed by the intensity and precision of the assault. After the raid, every major dam in Germany received massive reinforcement of anti-aircraft defences. The Mörner alone eventually had over 60 flak guns of various calibers, along with searchlights, barrage balloons, and concrete bunkers for the gun crews. Massive steel nets were extended across the reservoirs to prevent any repeat of the skip bombing technique. Patrol boats, with sonar, were deployed to detect any attempt at underwater sabotage. The resource cost was enormous, but the psychological impact of the raid made it necessary. German leadership couldn't afford another spectacular success. The repair of the dams became a showcase of German engineering and organisation. Work began within days of the breach. Thousands of workers, many of them forced labourers and prisoners of war, were mobilised. Concrete was poured continuously, 24 hours a day. Railroad lines were built to bring in materials. Entire quarries were dedicated to providing aggregate. The Mörner Dam repair alone consumed over 70,000 cubic metres of concrete, more material than many entire factories required. The speed of repair was impressive, but it came at tremendous cost in human suffering. The forced labourers worked in brutal conditions, inadequate food, long hours, harsh treatment. Many died from exhaustion, accidents, or deliberate mistreatment. Some were executed for sabotage, real or imagined. The rebuilt dam was stronger than the original, but the human cost was incalculable. Strategically, the debate continues about whether the raid was worth the cost. In pure military terms, the damage inflicted was significant but not decisive. German war production in the Ruhr was disrupted for several months but recovered. The power generation shortfall was compensated for by increased output from other facilities and reduced civilian allocation. The flood damage, while extensive, didn't permanently cripple German industry. Some historians argue that the same resources devoted to the dam raid, 19 Lancasters and their highly trained crews, could have achieved more through conventional bombing operations. If those crews had survived and flown normal operations for the rest of the war, they might have destroyed more factories, sunk more ships, inflicted more cumulative damage than one spectacular raid. But this analysis misses the intangible impacts. The raid demonstrated that British innovation could match German technology. It proved that even the most heavily defended targets were vulnerable to the right combination of weapon and tactic. It showed that Bomber Command could execute precision operations, not just area bombing. These psychological and strategic benefits are harder to quantify but no less real. For the RAF, the raid provided something desperately needed in mid-1943, proof that tactical innovation and precision could complement strategic bombing. The debates within Bomber Command between those who favoured area bombing and those who advocated precision attacks were fierce. Harris believed in overwhelming force against entire cities. Others argued for surgical strikes against key targets. The dam raids didn't settle the debate, but they proved that precision was possible when the circumstances warranted it. 607 Squadron's continued operations demonstrated this further. After the dams, they attacked the Dortmund-Ems Canal, crippling German barge traffic. They sank the Tirpitz, eliminating Germany's last major surface threat in Norwegian waters. They destroyed V-weapon sites with tallboy bombs that could penetrate 20 feet of reinforced concrete. These weren't area bombing operations. They were precision strikes against targets where accuracy mattered more than tonnage. The technology developed for the dam raids had unexpected applications. The Spotlight altimeter system, simple but effective, was adapted for other low-level operations. The principles of skip bombing were studied by the US Navy and applied in the Pacific, where B-25 Mitchell bombers used skip bombing techniques against Japanese shipping with devastating effect. The hydrostatic fusing technology developed for the Upkeep bomb influenced post-war depth charge and mine design. Wallis's later earthquake bombs, the Tallboy and Grand Slam, used penetration physics inspired by his dam studies. The Grand Slam, weighing 22,000 pounds and capable of penetrating over 100 feet of earth before exploding, was essentially a non-bouncing evolution of the Upkeep concept, using mass and velocity to place explosive force exactly where it would cause maximum structural damage. The human stories from the raid became legend. Guy Gibson's leadership under fire, making repeated runs over the Mooney to draw flak while other aircraft attacked, earned him the Victoria Cross. His citation specifically mentioned his courage in repeatedly exposing himself to intense fire to allow other crews to attack safely. Gibson became a celebrity, used for propaganda and morale purposes, sent on speaking tours. He hated it. He wanted to return to operations, to lead his squadron, to fly combat missions. Instead, he spent months giving speeches and attending ceremonies. When he finally convinced the Air Ministry to let him return to operational flying, he lasted only a few months before being killed. Some historians suggest he deliberately sought dangerous missions, unable to cope with survivors' guilt. Whether true or not, his death at 26 ended one of the RAF's most remarkable careers. Flight Lieutenant Joe McCarthy, an American serving in the RAF, commanded one of the reserve aircraft and attacked the Sorp Dam. His route to the target was plagued by problems, delayed takeoff, navigation errors, and damage from ground fire. He reached the Sorp alone without support and made multiple runs over the dam, attacking from a different angle than the main force because the Sorp was an earth dam requiring a different bombing technique. His persistence and skill earned him the Distinguished Service Order. McCarthy survived the war, returned to the United States, and rarely spoke about his experiences. In interviews decades later, he insisted he was just doing his job, that the real heroes were the men who didn't come home. Flight Lieutenant Dave Shannon, the pilot who made 6 aborted runs at the Edda before successfully attacking, was 20 years old at the time of the raid. Australian, had joined the RAF in 1941 and flew with 617 Squadron through the rest of the war. He survived over 60 operations, an almost unbelievable survival rate. After the war, he remained in the RAF, eventually retiring as a group captain. In his later years, he participated in reunions and gave interviews, always emphasizing the teamwork and professionalism of the crews. Shannon dismissed his multiple aborted runs at the Edda as simply proper procedure. "You don't release until the conditions are right," he said. "Doesn't matter how many runs it takes, you get it right or you don't drop." That discipline, that refusal to compromise on precision, exemplified the ethos that made the raid possible. Barnes Wallis continued designing weapons and aircraft for the rest of his career. After the war, he pioneered swing wing technology, developing variable geometry wing designs that influenced later aircraft like the F-111 and Tornado. He worked on supersonic aircraft concepts, on space launch systems, on advanced materials. He received a knighthood in 1968, became a Fellow of the Royal Society, and was celebrated as one of Britain's greatest engineers. But he never forgot the cost of his innovations. Visitors to his home in later years reported that he kept a photograph on his desk, a group shot of 617 Squadron before the raid, with the faces of the 53 killed marked. When asked about the bouncing bomb, his most famous invention, he would acknowledge its success but always mention the men who died proving it worked. "Innovation without cost is invention," he once said. "Innovation that requires sacrifice is warfare. I gave them a weapon. They gave their lives. The debt is mine." The German perspective on the raid evolved over time. Immediately after the attack, official propaganda minimized the damage, claiming repairs were already underway and that British losses had been severe. Internally, the assessment was grimmer. Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments, visited the breached dams and reported to Hitler that the damage was catastrophic. Production in the Ruhr had been severely disrupted. Reconstruction would require massive resources. More troubling was the implication. If the British could destroy dams, what else might they destroy? Speer recommended immediate reinforcement of all vulnerable infrastructure and diversion of substantial anti-aircraft resources to protect key installations. Hitler, characteristically, blamed the Luftwaffe for failing to intercept the raiders and ordered reprisals against British targets. The reprisals accomplished little except further draining German resources. German engineers who examined the breached dams recognized the sophistication of the attack. Reports circulated among technical personnel describing the precision required, the innovative weapon design, the tactical execution. Some German scientists attempted to convince their superiors that Germany should develop similar weapons, but by 1943, German military research was already overwhelmed with competing priorities: jets, rockets, new U-boats, advanced tanks, and countless other projects competed for resources. A specialized dam-busting weapon that had been used once and would likely never be used again because all dams were now heavily defended didn't merit attention. The Germans fundamentally misunderstood the purpose of the raid. They saw it as a one-off spectacular attack against a specific target. The British understood it as proof of concept for precision weapons and tactics that could be applied elsewhere. The environmental impact of the dam breaches was enormous and long-lasting. The floods scoured the Ruhr and Eder valleys, stripping topsoil, destroying ecosystems and changing water flow patterns. Some areas didn't recover for years. Fish populations were decimated. Forests were damaged by the flood wave. Agricultural land was buried under silt and debris. These consequences were unintended but unavoidable. Wallis and the mission planners had focused on military and industrial targets, but the water didn't discriminate. It destroyed everything in its path. The civilian casualties, particularly among forced labourers housed in the valleys, raised moral questions that persist. Were the raids justified despite killing over 1,000 civilians, many of them not Germans but people from occupied countries forced to work in German factories? The ethical calculus of strategic bombing has never been simple, and the dam raids sit uncomfortably in that debate. For the survivors of 617 Squadron, life after the dams was complex. They were celebrated as heroes, given medals and honours, but they continued flying dangerous missions. The squadron's motto, "After me the flood," referenced the biblical deluge but also their role as pathfinders and precision attackers. They marked targets for main force bombers, attacked objectives other squadrons couldn't reach, and accepted casualty rates that would have broken normal units. Of the aircrew who participated in the dam raid and survived, several were killed in later operations. The survival rate for completing a tour of operations in Bomber Command was about 44%. Completing 2 tours dropped to about 20%. Many of the dam raiders were already on their 2nd or 3rd tours when they volunteered for 617 Squadron. Statistically, they were living on borrowed time. The technical analysis of why the bouncing bomb worked reveals the genius of Wallis's engineering. The backspin was crucial. When the cylindrical bomb hit the water, the backspin created a lifting force that caused it to skip rather than sink. The physics are similar to how a spinning baseball curves the Magnus effect. The spin also stabilized the bomb's trajectory, preventing it from tumbling or yawing. The shape of the bomb, cylindrical rather than spherical, maximized the skip effect while providing sufficient volume for explosive. The wooden outer casing served multiple purposes. It provided buoyancy, helped the bomb skip, and shattered on impact, allowing the steel core to sink while preventing the bomb from bouncing over the dam. The hydrostatic fuse measured water pressure to determine depth. At exactly 30 feet, the pressure triggered detonation. This depth was critical. Too shallow, and the blast would vent upward uselessly. Too deep and the energy would dissipate into the reservoir bottom. 30 feet was the calculated optimum for concentrating force against the dam wall. The delivery parameters were equally critical. 60 feet altitude was chosen because it was low enough to avoid radar detection and flak accuracy, but high enough that the bomb would skip rather than simply crash into the water. The speed of 220 miles per hour balanced several factors. Faster would have given the bomb more energy for longer skips, but made accurate aiming impossible. Slower would have made the aircraft more vulnerable to flak. The distance of 400 yards from the dam was calculated based on skip distance. Too close and the bomb would strike the dam above water or at the wrong angle. Too far and it wouldn't reach the wall. Every parameter was interconnected. Change one and you'd have to recalculate the others. The tolerances were measured in feet and seconds. Gibson's description of the attack as threading a needle, while someone shoots at you wasn't hyperbole, the training program developed for 617 Squadron became a model for later special operations units. The emphasis on precision, on rehearsing until every crew member could perform their role perfectly under stress, on understanding the physics and engineering of what they were attempting, created a culture of professionalism that outlasted the original squadron members. New crews joining 617 Squadron after the Dam raid found themselves held to standards higher than anywhere else in Bomber Command. Navigation had to be precise to within seconds, bombing had to be accurate to within yards, formation flying had to be so tight that wingtips almost touched. These weren't arbitrary standards. They were the requirements for the missions the squadron flew. If you couldn't meet them, you didn't fly with 6117. This culture of excellence produced results. The squadron's accuracy rate on precision targets exceeded 80%, compared to about 20% for Bomber Command overall. The bouncing bomb concept influenced post-war thinking about precision weapons. The idea that a specialized weapon, precisely delivered, could achieve effects that mass bombing couldn't became central to modern air warfare doctrine. Smart bombs, cruise missiles, laser-guided munitions all trace intellectual lineage to concepts proven at the Murner and Ida dams. You don't need 1,000 bombs if one bomb, correctly placed and detonated, can destroy the target. This realization, purchased with the lives of 53 airmen in May 1943, reshaped how military forces think about air power. The emphasis shifted from tonnage to accuracy, from area effects to precision engagement. Not immediately, the technology didn't exist yet, but the conceptual framework was established. The legacy of the Dam raids remains contentious among historians. Some view them as a wasteful spectacular that achieved little strategic value at tremendous cost. Others see them as a necessary demonstration of British resolve and innovation at a critical moment in the war. The truth probably lies between these extremes. The raids didn't end the war. They didn't cripple German industry permanently, but they proved that innovation could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. They demonstrated that precise application of force could achieve results that brute force couldn't. They showed that courage, skill, and determination could accomplish what skeptics called impossible. In May 1943, Britain needed these lessons. The war had dragged on for nearly 4 years. Victory seemed distant. Morale was fragile. The Dam raids provided tangible proof that Germany could be beaten, that British science and courage were equal to the challenge, that the impossible was merely difficult. For the families of the 53 killed, no amount of strategic analysis justifies the loss. Parents buried sons who should have buried them. Wives became widows before their lives really began. Children grew up without fathers. The debt owed to these men and their families is beyond calculation. They volunteered for a mission they knew was likely suicidal. They executed it with precision and courage. They died doing what they believed was necessary to defeat tyranny. Whether history judges the raid as strategically justified or questionably worthwhile doesn't diminish their sacrifice. They did what was asked of them. They didn't come home. That's the only assessment that matters to the families who lost them. The enduring image of the Dam raids is water, millions of tons of it, pouring through breached concrete walls, unstoppable and devastating. That image captures both the success of the operation and its fundamental violence. The raid didn't just destroy dams, it weaponized nature itself, turned the reservoir's own water into a demolition force more powerful than any explosive. The floods that resulted killed over 600 people, destroyed countless buildings, and reshaped valleys. This wasn't precision in the modern sense of minimizing collateral damage. It was precision in achieving the intended effect, breaching the dams, with consequences that spread far beyond the immediate target. This tension between precision delivery and widespread effects characterizes all strategic bombing. You can accurately hit what you're aiming at, but the results of that hit may spread uncontrollably. When the surviving members of 617 Squadron gathered for reunions in later years, they didn't talk much about the raid itself. They talked about the crews who didn't come back. They talked about training, about the Lancaster, about the odd details that stick in memory. The smell of hydraulic fluid mixed with oil and sweat. The sound of 4 Merlin engines synchronized. A particular thrumming that veteran aircrew could recognize instantly. The feeling of flying at 60 feet over water in darkness, the altimeter useless, relying entirely on 2 spotlight beams converging on the surface below. These sensory memories, more than the strategic debates or historical analysis, defined their experience. For them, the raid wasn't about destroying German industry or proving that precision weapons worked. It was about flying a Lancaster at impossible altitude and speed, releasing a weapon that probably wouldn't work, and somehow surviving to come home. That 11 of 19 crews made it back was itself a kind of miracle. The last surviving member of the Dam Raid crews was George Johnson, rear gunner in AJT piloted by Joe McCarthy. Johnson died in December 2022 at age 101. For decades, he attended commemorations, gave interviews, and patiently explained what the raid had been like. In his final interviews, he emphasized that the raid succeeded because of teamwork, training, and luck. The weapon worked because Wallis designed it brilliantly. The mission succeeded because Gibson planned it carefully. But individual survival, Johnson believed, was pure chance. The flak gunner who missed, the German fighter that didn't intercept, the engine that kept running despite battle damage, these were the margins between life and death. Johnson's death closed the living link to the raid. Now it exists only in documents, photographs, and the memories of historians. The breached dams were repaired decades ago. The Lancasters that flew the mission are gone, scrapped, or sitting in museums. The men who designed the weapon and flew the aircraft are all dead. What remains is the story, and the questions it raises about innovation, courage, cost, and whether any military objective justifies the risks and casualties required to achieve it. These questions have no easy answers. They didn't in 1943. They don't now. Retry.